Gulbárdier's horse galloped down through the mist, as he rode out to bloodshed that mid-morning crisp. Out across the moor and down through the dale, the ground mist pre-spun that tragic death veil. Calls from the woods as the canes were beat, to frighten the pheasants from their dawn retreat. The sound of hooves hollowed sharp on the clay, as to the end of his life his mount sped him that day. Some greater instinct, something savage and sharp, had loaded his pistol and bled dry his heart. This man of outstanding upbringing and pride now went not to mass with a cane by his side. The sun had just risen and frost pinched the air, the snowdrops in blossom, pure without care. Gulbárdier's beast, a brawny black colt, snorted out clouds through its mane slick with salt. Passing, a groom on the road tipped his cap, but never was seen by the figure in black, dressed in his cloak with no hat on his head, betraying the fact that he'd not been to bed, but sat up all night in the study of his house, not blinking nor breathing, but quiet as a mouse, watching intently the strike of the clock, listening with fear for the turn of the lock. Feeling those hours between midnight and dawn, the ones between which all our nightmares are born. So softly they came, footfalls on the stairs, delicate, well-trod, like a young female hair. The scent of her perfume curled into the room, the fire extinguished, the hearth casting gloom. So quiet she was, like a death-stalking stoat, gliding the night like Manannan's grey boat. Gulbárdier sat as stiff as a corpse, restraining his body, restraining his thoughts. Her moon-pallid hand placed a key in the latch, silk hanky stifled to silence the catch. In seconds she had gone, away across the fields, with a haste only fresh love in woman can yield. Gulbárdier's mind had it all settled out, a rich lover in velvet from the city or south, a young certain man with an eye for desire, to ignite a tempestuous funeral pyre. Slick-backed black hair in a foppish horse tail, stinking of potpourri, candy, sweet basil. A new oil baron with plenty of wealth, sent from the New World and sure of himself, stealing away with good English wives, with promises of taking them on to new lives. Incredible charm and a privileged figure, bred on the best-scented soap and fine liquor, needing to learn that good English laws weren't meant to be grubbed by his oily paws. Unable to move, frozen by rage, the beast finally bending the bars of its cage, Gulbárdier rose and, cocking his gun, saddled his horse in the 5 o'clock sun. He mounted his steed and decided to roam, and knock on the doors of each stately home, to seek out the place with the scarlet-cowled bed, where he pictured his wife to be parting her legs, absorbed in the intimate embraces of love, whilst a gross lusty falcon would ravage his dove. Her frail trembling heart pressed close against his, whilst she entered her softly with arrogant bliss. Lightly she'd breathe and whisper his name, and he'd ride her in fury to the point where he came, and his sallow white seed would burst in her gut, and she'd writhe in her ecstasy, eyes tightly shut, begging for more as her sweet-scented sweat salted the point where their lips softly met. With such a thought his throat became dry, and all of his body was begging to cry. But restrained in his anger, he silently knew that the only release was to murder the two. 2 hours he had travelled, 30 miles and 3 homes, 9 pot-hands, 2 grooms, and the wind in his bones. Drizzle-strung strands of his hair lashed his eyes, soul-mirrored storm clouds rode high in the sky. One more house within reach where the culprit may lie, out along Correndon Way by the rise. He wheeled his horse about on 2 hooves. The sound of its galloping thunderclap shoes sent fear and foreboding to every man, be they noble or servant or merely house-hand. But Gulbárdier's flesh felt weary and old, and his vengeful heart was immune to the cold. He rode and he rode and he pushed the steed on, and the house came in sight before very long. Just as he swung back his whip to the flank, he glimpsed something move behind the hedge bank. The shimmering ghost of a lady's silk veil blew in the wind like a gossamer sail, caught by the thorny hands of a branch, starkly contrasting the soft and the harsh. One long moment, frozen and still, one breath caught in the fish's gill, one eye narrowing in numb disbelief, one heart breaking under its grief. With an air of caution he edged the beast on, heartbeat and hoofbeat merged into one, strangely excited by what he might find, eyes glistening yet sightless as one who is blind. The gate to the field lay crooked and broke, twisted old hinges let out a shrill croak. The plot narrowed down to a dip in a copse, fruit-yielding trees now as bare as the rocks. Somewhere down there, in the dip, came a sound, a breath of desire, of love deep and profound, a sound so tender it mimicked the sea, with its rhythm of lust, salty and free. Gulbárdier rose to the top of the bank, and looked down surprised at this great city swank. Nowhere the horsetail or slick soapy fop, nowhere the sweet sage with money to drop. There was the man with hands on his wife, there was the man with the love of his life. Not a great banker, a lawyer or judge, only a stable hand dressed in his grubs. Never a man so tenderly gazed with love at a woman in all of his days as the way this young groom looked into her eyes, a look of such trust no man could disguise. And the shame of it all burned Gulbárdier's face as he realized his negligence and his disgrace. Never once had he looked at her in that way, not since they wed, right up to this day. And that young pretender had given it free, the feelings inside that he just couldn't be, the words and the thoughts he couldn't express, that youth had provided in one small caress. It rendered his heart, it crippled his soul, the blood drained away, thoughts hardened like coal. There they were in the open, squished in a ditch, that delectable cur and his mummery bitch. Rage built in his throat and rose to a tone, gurgled up through his mouth and exploded a groan. Both lovers looked up, wide-eyed in surprise, rabbits caught in the gun sight, shock in their eyes. They saw this great man, towering tall, mounted atop of a steed like a bull. Both of them saw he was wounded and hurt, ready to plunge them both under the dirt. In the second before riding down from the hill, the moonlight and starlight fell perfectly still. He found himself met by the eyes of his wife, fearful and scared, tearful of life. Her eyes were the colour of cornflower blue, her skin just as soft as the child he once knew. But her heart had grown up, and he'd never once seen the pain he had caused by destroying the dream. The words he had whispered when first they had met, the things he had promised, the path he had set. All that he wasn't and never had been returned to his mind in a shattering scream. As he lifted the barrel of the gun to his side, aimed not at the groom, only his bride. He wanted to take just her with him now, to a land far away, to a new wedding vow. The first hoofbeat fell on the side of the slope. The groom grabbed her hand and they ran without hope, stumbling blindly for cover of trees. Her trembling legs brought her down to her knees. The groom swung around to pull her back up, her silvery dress now blackened with muck. Carrying her on in arms fervent and strong, the woman to whom his heart always belonged. And now, as they turned to make their last stand, backs to the man who could not understand, stumbling and choking with every breath, to a world where the night would unite them in death. A deafening sound stopped them right where they stood, the sound of a gunshot that rang through the wood. In terror and turmoil they gazed at each other, to see which one fell in the arms of the other. A moment passed, and neither collapsed. A few moments more, and their muscles relaxed. They both turned to see what fate had achieved, not daring to hope for the god's own reprieve. Gulbárdier rode with his mind all afire, watching them flee like hares to the briar, trying to outrun his four-legged beast so's not to become the flesh of his feast. He raised up his gun to fire on them both, for the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, enacting revenge for his marriage betrayed, reclaiming the woman with whom he once laid. When all of a sudden, that slippery slope caught at the leg of his horse, and it broke. An agonized scream escaped from the colt as it tumbled and spun in a somersault. As its head went down, the gun came up, till Gulbárdier's chin was struck by the butt. In the blink of an eye his finger had squeezed, and blown out his brains on the chill winter's breeze, sending his thoughts out into the night, where the frozen north wind extinguished their light, and the stars in the sky reeled in a dance that spoke of a horse-hand's tender romance. There she lay across his chest, weeping with sorrow and woeful regret. The groom stood sullen, respectfully by, fearful to touch her, watching her cry. Gulbárdier lay at the foot of the hill, horse close at hand, neck broken and still, looking almost at peace. Just one thing betrayed, eyes open and glassy, gazing into the grave. Thick congealed blood encrusted the grass. It covered her face like a crimson death mask, for she burrowed her head deep into his chest, preserving his soul from the land in the west. And always she'd known what had lain in his breast, a mind full of passion, but never at rest, mute by the fears of what he might say, as cold as the night to her brilliant day. After a while the groom cautiously came, and lifted her up, softly speaking her name. She held on to his hand, trembling yet strong. She knew in her heart that she'd never done wrong. And all through the land a great silence fell, over every meadow and every dell, and everyone knew, whether sleeping or awake, that the world holds no place for sorrow or hate.